Before you became the most powerful empire in the world for 600 years, before you controlled 3 continents, before sultans ruled from golden thrones, there was one man, a warrior chieftain with 400 horsemen who would murder, betray, and conquer his way into creating a dynasty that would shake the foundations of Europe and Asia. His name was Ertugrul Bey, and the blood he spilled to build his legacy would fill rivers. We know almost nothing about him for certain, and that's exactly how he wanted it. While other medieval rulers left behind chronicles, monuments, and detailed records, Ertugrul moved through history like a ghost, a phantom whose very existence was debated by historians for centuries. What we do know is terrifying. This wasn't some noble hero founding an empire through diplomacy and wisdom. This was a man who understood one fundamental truth. In 13th century Anatolia, you either killed or you were killed. And Ertugrul chose to kill. The year is somewhere around 1230, and the world is burning. The Mongol hordes of Genghis Khan have just finished devastating everything from China to Eastern Europe. Millions are dead. Entire civilizations have been erased. The Seljuk Sultanate of Rum, the great Turkish empire that once controlled Anatolia, is collapsing like a house of cards. Refugees flood westward in desperate waves, and among them rides a relatively small tribe called the Kai, led by their chieftain, Suleiman Shah, Ertugrul's father. According to legend, Suleiman Shah drowns crossing the Euphrates River. Whether this was an accident, an assassination, or something else entirely, we'll never know. What we do know is that Ertugrul immediately takes control of the tribe, and he's facing an impossible situation. 400 families, maybe 1,500 warriors if you count every man who can hold a sword, surrounded by enemies on all sides. The Mongols to the east, the Byzantines to the west, rival Turkish tribes everywhere, and a dying Seljuk Sultan who can barely control his own capital. Any reasonable person would have sought shelter, pledged loyalty to a stronger power, maybe tried to survive until things settled down. Ertugrul looked at this chaos and saw opportunity. Here's where the story gets interesting, because what Ertugrul did next would be considered brilliant strategy or cold-blooded opportunism, depending on who's telling the tale. He approached the Seljuk Sultan Aledin Kekubad and offered his services as a frontier warrior, not as a subordinate, mind you. Ertugrul negotiated for land, for independence, for the right to conquer in the Sultan's name and keep what he took. The Sultan, desperate for anyone willing to fight the Byzantines on the crumbling western frontier, agreed. He granted Ertugrul a small territory around the town of Sot, right on the border with the Byzantine Empire. This was a death sentence disguised as a reward. The land was worthless, constantly raided, impossible to defend. The Byzantines had fortresses everywhere. Other Turkish warlords would view any success as a threat. Ertugrul was essentially being told to go die on the frontier fighting Christians and stop bothering the real power players. But Ertugrul understood something that everyone else missed. On the frontier, there were no rules, no one watching, no one to question how you expanded your territory or who you killed to do it. The Sultan was too weak to interfere. The Byzantines too disorganized to mount a coordinated defense, and the Mongols hadn't reached this far west yet. Ertugrul had just been handed a blank check to build his own kingdom, and he was going to write it in blood. The next 40 years are shrouded in mystery, but the results speak for themselves. Ertugrul's tiny tribe didn't just survive, they thrived, they expanded, they grew wealthy, and they did it through a combination of military brilliance and absolutely ruthless pragmatism that would make Machiavelli look like an amateur. Did you know that Ertugrul pioneered a strategy that his descendants would use for the next 3 centuries? He didn't just conquer Byzantine territories, he converted them. When he captured a Christian village, he didn't massacre everyone like the Mongols did. Instead, he offered them a choice: convert to Islam and join the growing Turkish community, or pay a tax and keep your religion. It sounds almost progressive until you realize this wasn't about tolerance. This was about building a power base. Every converted Christian became a Turkish warrior. Every village that submitted became a source of revenue and manpower. Ertugrul was building an army one village at a time. But make no mistake, when villages resisted, the violence was apocalyptic. Byzantine chronicles from the era describe Turkish raids that left entire regions depopulated. Women and children sold into slavery, men killed or forced to flee, churches burned, monasteries abandoned. Ertugrul was conducting what we would now call ethnic cleansing, systematically replacing the Byzantine Christian population with Turkish Muslims, and he was doing it with terrifying efficiency. And it wasn't just the Byzantines who had to fear him. Other Turkish tribes, rivals who competed for the same lands and the same plunder, started disappearing. Some submitted and were absorbed into Ertugrul's growing confederation. Others fought and were destroyed. There are hints in later Ottoman chronicles of betrayals, of alliances made and broken, of tribal leaders who opposed Ertugrul and mysteriously died under suspicious circumstances. Ertugrul was consolidating power, and anyone who stood in his way had a very short life expectancy. Think about this from a modern perspective. Imagine a refugee arriving in a foreign land with nothing but a few hundred followers, and within a single lifetime, transforming that into an independent principality that controlled strategic territory, commanded thousands of warriors, and terrified its neighbors. That's not just impressive, that's unprecedented. And Ertugrul did it without the advantages of superior technology, vast wealth, or powerful allies. He did it through pure strategic genius combined with a willingness to do whatever was necessary to win. But here's what's truly fascinating, and what historians still debate. Ertugrul wasn't building an empire for himself. He was in his 70s, maybe even his 80s during his final campaigns. He was building something for his son, Osman, and he was teaching that son everything he knew about power, about conquest, about survival. Every raid, every battle, every political maneuver was a lesson. Ertugrul was creating the blueprint for what would become the Ottoman Empire, and Osman was his star pupil. The Kai tribe's emblem was the crescent moon and star. Ertugrul would tell his warriors that this symbolized their destiny, to grow from nothing into something that would illuminate the darkness. It sounds poetic, almost romantic, but the reality was much darker. That crescent moon was rising over countless corpses, and that star was lighting the way to 3 centuries of conquest that would terrify Europe. Now here's the revelation that changes everything we think we know about Ertugrul. For centuries, historians assumed he was a relatively minor figure, maybe even fictional, because he left almost no direct historical evidence. No coins minted in his name, no inscriptions, no surviving documents. Some scholars argued he never existed at all, that later Ottoman sultans invented him to create a mythical founding father, but recent archaeological discoveries have changed that narrative completely. Excavations around Suut have uncovered evidence of massive Byzantine settlements that were suddenly abandoned in the mid-13th century, replaced by Turkish Islamic communities. Pottery shards, building foundations, burial practices, all showing a complete population replacement happening exactly when Ertugrul would have been conducting his campaigns. The man existed, and his impact was even more devastating than the legend suggested. What's more, Byzantine tax records that survived show something extraordinary. Villages in the region where Ertugrul operated stopped paying taxes to Constantinople around 1260 and never resumed. An entire frontier region just vanished from Byzantine control, not through a single dramatic conquest, but through a slow, methodical process of raids and settlement that took decades. Ertugrul wasn't just a warrior, he was conducting a demographic revolution, fundamentally changing who lived in Anatolia. Ertugrul died sometime around 1280, probably in his late 80s, which was an extraordinary age for a medieval warrior. He lived long enough to see his son Osman take control of the tribe, long enough to see the foundations of an empire being laid. Legend says that on his deathbed he called Osman to his side and told him, "My son, you are now the leader of the Kai, but never forget, we are Ghazis, warriors of the faith. Our destiny is not to build walls and grow fat. Our destiny is to conquer." And conquer they did. Osman would take everything his father taught him and expand the territory tenfold. Osman's son, Orhan, would capture Bursa and make it the first Ottoman capital. Orhan's descendants would cross into Europe, conquer Constantinople, rule from the gates of Vienna to the Persian Gulf, from the Sahara Desert to the Caucasus Mountains. The Ottoman Empire would last until 1923, 643 years, and it all started with one man and 400 horsemen willing to kill anyone who stood in their way. But here's what haunts historians. Ertugrul's tomb still exists in Suut, a massive stone structure rebuilt and renovated countless times over the centuries. Millions of tourists visit it every year, but we have no idea if he's actually buried there. No contemporary source mentions where Ertugrul was laid to rest. The tomb might be empty, a monument to a myth rather than a man. Even in death, Ertugrul remains a mystery, a ghost who changed the world and left almost no trace of his passage. So was Ertugrul a visionary leader who saved his people from destruction and built the foundations of a great civilization? Or was he a ruthless warlord who murdered and displaced thousands to carve out his own kingdom? The answer, like most things in history, is probably both. He was a product of his time, a 13th century warrior operating in a world where mercy was weakness and hesitation meant death. He did what he had to do to ensure his people's survival, and if that meant rivers of blood, so be it. The real question is this: could the Ottoman Empire have existed without Ertugrul? Could someone else have seized that moment, that opportunity on the collapsing Byzantine frontier? Or was it his specific combination of strategic brilliance, absolute ruthlessness, and sheer survival instinct that made it possible? We'll never know for certain, but one thing is clear. The man who started an empire understood that history is written by those willing to do whatever it takes to win. What do you think? Was Ertugrul a hero who founded one of history's greatest empires, or a brutal conqueror whose violence just happened to create something lasting? Drop your thoughts in the comments below.